Earlier this year, I hosted my first panel, and two things happened. One, a room full of people found out what a human train wreck I am, and two, I was gifted with a reproduction copy of the January 1st, 1987 issue of Weekly Shonen Jump. To put in context just how long ago this was the issue of Shonen Jump that the first chapter of JoJo's Bizarre Adventure was published in. In other words, shonen manga before Goku vs. Frieza, before the Stardust Crusaders, and before the Big Three had defined what modern shonen is. But this was also Jump at the end of an era, on the cusp of a dramatic paradigm shift that would forever change the way people saw shonen manga. And so, I'd like to explore this issue and see what series and trends were popular at this time, and what exactly happened to change that. And to do that, we need to go back to the time of its publication. We need to go back to the 80s. The 1980s! 1987 was a flamboyantly fun year for entertainment, a year that saw the rise of the Teenage Mutant Ninja Turtles, when the Xenomorph would finally meet its match in The Predator, and Hulk Hogan would take on Andre the Giant in WrestleMania 3. For Japan, this was the era that anime and manga would become legitimate forces of entertainment, with 1985's Nausicaa Valley of the Wind establishing the legend of Studio Ghibli, as well as the release of Akira, which awoke the world to the potential of Japanese animation. This was also the era that saw the rise of the 80s American action hero. Films like Terminator, Commando, and Rambo had taken the more sensibly proportioned action stars of the 70s and hurled them off a balcony, leaving instead only Herculean super beings, indestructible men of muscle and justice, capable of shaking off the most dire of bullet wounds and blasting their way through entire armies of enemy soldiers. They were also a rare case of a foreign property actively penetrating and influencing Japanese pop culture, with the majority of major American action movies gaining cinematic releases in Japan, and you can see this influence directly in the protagonists and art style of Shonen Jump from this period. Muscled heroes like Violence Jack had seen some degree of success in the 70s, but this new breed of action hero-inspired protagonists would take mainstream shonen manga out of the cockpits of mechs and into the realms of guts and testosterone, and king among them was a character directly inspired by Mad Max and Bruce Lee, Kenshiro from Fist of the North Star. North Star in the 80s was Jump's most established and popular series, a fan favourite that sold millions of tankobons every year, with a successful anime airing worldwide and is still receiving major adaptations to this day. And key to North Star's success was Kenshiro, a massive muscled warrior and successor to the deadly Hokuto Shinken fighting style, who wandered a post-apocalypse wasteland, obliterating any evildoer that dared cross his path, and in the process crafting the perfect escapist power fantasy. The focus of Kenshiro's encounters were far less strategic than those of modern battle series, instead being far bloodier contests of pain and endurance, with Kenshiro's signature move being to tear off his clothes, pummel his opponents while striking successive pressure points before informing them, "Omae wa mou shindeiru." This gave Kenshiro a savage edge that belied his calm and stoic nature, and set him apart from earlier, more family-friendly shonen heroes like Captain Tsubasa and Astro Boy. But it was this distinction that let Fist of the North Star dominate 80s Shonen Jump, constantly outselling its rivals and being treated as Jump's premier series, which led to a host of other manga trying to replicate North Star's success, with some even completely changing direction to become more like it, such as Sakage Otakujuku, which started off life as an oddball tough guy gag manga, but by 1987 had transformed into a full-blown North Star clone, complete with martial arts, pressure points, and the intellectual property-shattering line, "You're late in realizing it. From the moment our fists met, you were already enchanted by the death god." Sakegake was not alone in this regard. Kirara was basically Fist of the North Star in high school, Sekiryo was Samurai North Star, and JoJo's Bizarre Adventure was Fist of the North Star if written by a crazy person. And even outside series that North Star was directly influencing, you could see this same worship of muscle and masculinity in other series like Kinnikuman. The series started off as a parody of Ultraman, but eventually went on to become its own legitimate sports/battle manga centered around pro wrestling. Kinnikuman's contribution to Shonen in general is vastly undercredited in the West, but it's a much beloved series in Japan, having directly influenced creators like Ichiro Oda, Hiromu Arakawa, and Hiro Mashima. Even other, more grounded series from Jump featured protagonists that were less the teenage boys reading Jump and more so the adult men that they aspired to be. Even the massively popular sports manga Captain Tsubasa had by this point seen its soccer-loving child protagonist grow into a gargantuan, fully grown man measuring about 19 heads high. One of the most popular titles featuring an older male protagonist was the noir-esque crime drama City Hunter, telling the story of private detective and borderline sex offender Ryo Saiba working the streets of a criminal-ridden 80s Tokyo. While not quite as ripped as some of his counterparts, Saiba boasted the same level of toughness and masculinity that was so prominent in this era. At one point, he even shoots through his own hand in order to catch his opponent off guard. Jump of the mid-80s can be defined by its focus on hyper-masculine heroes. And so, what were the reasons these kind of heroes were so popular with the Japanese audience? And what exactly happened to change that? Well, I think there's two reasons this kind of character did become so popular. The first and most simple being that Jump of 1987 was nearly 20 years old. And a lot of Jump's initial audience had simply grown up and therefore would be more drawn to stories about grown men, which they'd find more relatable. But I think there's also a deeper, more troubling reason people wanted to believe in strong, stoic heroes like Kenshiro. While Japan in the 80s was going through a positive economic growth period, the increased focus on business and productivity meant that socially, things were becoming increasingly strenuous for young people, with intense pressure to get into prestigious schools and acquire jobs in well-respected companies. And the social pressure cooker this created is what's attributed to have brought about Japan's era of strange crime, which saw a massive increase of violent crime without any clear motive. Comparatively, Japan's crime rate of this era was still far lower than other countries, but the scope and bizarreness of some of these crimes shook Japan's public to its core, one such incident being the case of the monster with 21 faces. An individual or group of individuals involved in kidnapping, as well as documented cases of lacing children's confectionery with potassium cyanide and planting it in Japanese supermarkets. The group behind the incident were never caught, but they would constantly goad the police, resulting in the police chief officer on the case committing suicide by self-immolation. Incidents like this would have made Japan of the 80s feel like a frightening place, a place where the bad guys were real and they were winning. And so it's easy to imagine readers taking comfort in the fantasy of invincible heroes like Kenshiro, who would deliver swift and brutal justice to the bandits of the wastelands, restoring order to a society in chaos. By January 1st, 1987, however, the tide had begun to turn for shonen manga. For as dominant as Fist of the North Star and titles like it were, a new, entirely different type of series had risen up to challenge Kenshiro for his throne, and that series was Dragonball. I've already done a full video on Dragonball, which I will link in the description, but some of it does bear repeating here, so apologies if you're hearing parts of this for a second time. Despite how popular Dragon Ball would eventually become, it wasn't actually hugely successful when it was first serialized, and this was partially due to how different it was from the standard Jump series of the time. Goku was by far the youngest protagonist in Jump of this era, and that combined with an extremely cute art style would have made Dragon Ball feel like a manga for babies, especially to an audience that had been weaned on the testosterone-fueled illustrations of the North Star era. But as Dragon Ball continued to be serialized, the quality of its construction and draftsmanship made it a very enjoyable manga to read, and the softer art style meant that it appealed to a much wider audience than just the muscle-obsessed teenage boys. And critically, Goku had the potential to grow and learn, which was in stark contrast to characters like Kenshiro. Throughout North Star, it was very rare for Kenshiro to learn new techniques or increase his physical abilities. He, for the most part, just existed in a constant state of badassery, which made him an ideal protagonist for a story about empowerment and escapism, but it also meant that the series wasn't left with many avenues to go down by 1987, with it concluding a year later. The generation that North Star inspired fared much the same, with most of these hyper-masculine series ending publication by 1990. And even the ones that survived, like JoJo's, changed drastically over the course of its run. Just look at how the character design of JoJo's protagonists evolved over time, growing less and less muscular and more slender and effeminate. I don't raise these points to disparage manly North Star style stories, just to explain why a shonen audience of the late 80s would have been hungry for something different, and that was a hunger that Dragon Ball satisfied. Goku could and regularly did lose fights, but it didn't matter because the focus was on the development of his abilities over time as opposed to a stationary level of strength. You can see this same shift in other series too. Take for example the title Kenritsu Umisora Koko Yakibun Yamashita Torakun, which is about a young lad who is really enamored with baseball, burdened by the fact that he's extremely bad at it. The series did exceptionally poorly in reader surveys upon its initial release, and I think again this was due to the combination of a young, underpowered main character depicted in a simpler, more rounded art style. But as the series continued and Torakun slowly improved his abilities, Jump's audience warmed to the character, and the series ended up running for an impressive 21 volumes. Yet another series booking the trends of shonen at the time was Saint Seiya, which had a far more shoujo-esque art style with characters that had softer, more delicate facial features. As a side note, this is also another series that's contribution to shonen is generally undervalued in the West, but it went a long way in instilling the virtues of friendship and teamwork in a battle manga, which also moved focus away from the invincible lone heroes of the North Star Age. These were the outliers of Shonen Jump in the 80s, these were the series that were going against the status quo. But these series were also the future, moving the direction of shonen away from the older, hyper-masculine aspirational hero and towards characters that were more relatable to a younger teenage audience. A trend that you'd see repeated by other non-Jump series that came later on in the 80s, like Ranma Half and fashionable judo girl Yuara, which both took the martial arts combat of series like North Star and spliced it with more shoujo-esque elements. And this would continue throughout the next 3 decades, with hyper-masculine muscled heroes becoming more and more of an oddity, with only occasional throwbacks like Toriko or even adult Goku, and even all the way to current-day Jump. Popular modern titles like My Hero Academia, Black Clover, and Promised Neverland all feature young, underpowered main characters depicted in a far softer, more stylized art style than anything of the North Star era, showing just how dramatic and long-lasting this paradigm shift actually was. We are left within this issue, however, with a few series that we've yet to cover, and unfortunately, these are the series that have been somewhat forgotten. The series that didn't fall into any major trends and seem to have been left behind. Sora no Canvas was a beautifully drawn romance manga about gymnasts in high school. Sude ni Tonshikan is a surreal gag manga about a group of teenage bandits, and High School Kinagame is another gag title about a group of misfits coming together and forming their high school's funny face club. I should add though that anything I say about these series is based purely on the single Japanese chapter published in this reproduction issue of Jump, as well as whatever snatches of information I could find from around the internet. In fact, any images of these series in this video are photos I took myself, as I couldn't find any scans online whatsoever. And I think there's something a little sad about that. These were once series published in the most popular manga magazine in existence, but now they've been lost to time. Thankfully, the final series of this issue narrowly avoided the same fate, and it's a good thing it did, as that series is Ginga Nagoroboshi Gin. And what's so cool and original about this manga is that this is a shonen battle series about dogs. And not like DeviantArt dogs, like dogs. It stars Gin, a Japanese bearhound who runs away from his family to form a pack of the strongest dogs in Japan, for the purpose of tracking down and killing a Kakabuto, a psychotic bear with a shotgun shell lodged in his brain, who incidentally also killed Gin's father and is terrorizing the mountainsides of Japan. The artwork is stunning, the fights are tense and brutal, and I'm bewildered as to why more modern titles haven't ripped off this series. Unfortunately, the manga never received an official English release, and the scans available online are of poor quality, which is a shame because the artwork deserves better. But it also makes you think of how easily this series too could have been lost. It did, however, get an anime adaptation, which I have not watched, but seems to be highly regarded. And, well, just check out this intro. Spectacular. The thing that gets me about Gin though is I don't know if I would have encountered this series if I hadn't decided to do this video. And to me, that's a decent reminder that the discussion around anime and manga doesn't always need to be about whatever's out this season. Sometimes it's worth looking back and seeing how we got to where we are and what we might have missed along the way. Friends, that's going to do it for my Shonen Jump retrospective, and I really hope you enjoyed this video. I'd like to thank Conspirit Luffy for giving me the issue of Jump that inspired me to do this. If you would like to help support this channel and create future videos like this, you can do so over at patreon.com/supereyepatchwolf. In particular, this video I'd like to thank Boris, JJ Death, JP Luna, Bing Theo, Tengoon, and Alison Becroft. Find me on the Let's Fight a Boss video game podcast or on Twitter at @eyepatchwolf. Friends, take care of yourselves, and I'll see you next time.